Hi everyone, greetings. We are today opening the last UTC session of this series about reporting during the pandemic. This activity is co-hosted by First Main Films and Smartly with the auspicious of UN Habitat, the World Urban Campaign. The Urban Thinkers Campus is an initiative of UN Habitat's World Urban Campaign, conceived as an open space for critical exchange and learnings between urban researchers, professionals, civil actors, community-based grassroots organizations, the media, and decision makers who believe that urbanization is an opportunity and can lead to positive urban transformation that benefit all. I would like to introduce first myself. I'm Analia Pastran, the founder of Smartly, a social enterprise on the SDGs that work in Latin America. I'm based in New York City. And I would like to welcome my colleague Sandeep Chakra from Asian Aid, India. He is the World Urban Campaign co-chair.
Thank you, and thank you, Analia. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, all the panelists. And it's a great honor for me to welcome all the people who are joining this from various parts of the world, from all the continents of the world. A very, very warm welcome from the World Urban Campaign of the UN Habitat. A very, very warm welcome from all of us who are on the panel today. A very, very warm welcome into the future of the 21st century. Friends, this is a call on, this is the 9th Urban Thinkers Campus. There have been several hundred Urban Thinkers campuses organized physically, both in the run-up to the new urban agenda, where the Urban Thinkers campuses were very instrumental, very crucial in giving ideas to what now formed the new urban agenda in 2016. Post 2016, once the new urban agenda came up, then the focus of the Urban Thinkers campuses has been on action, has been on generating solutions, has been on generating alternatives of the world we wish to see and the urban futures we wish to see, inclusive, mutually harmonious, respecting, and progressive to the future we want to see in the 21st century. So I invite you to this particular discussion, which is in a very different context, friends. In 2020, even as we were proposing the ideas for what cities would look like in the 21st centuries and solutions to what cities would look like in the 21st centuries, inclusive, for everybody, progressive, building better economics, building better livelihoods, building better resilience, many, many ideas which are embodied in the City We Need campaign that we run in 2019 and before. I invite you to look at the kind of ideas of the City We Need. We've not given it up, but here comes a pandemic in 2020. And this new series of the Urban Thinkers campuses, forced, if I may call it quote unquote, into a webinar space, is organized in the context of COVID and how the world changes with response to COVID, and therefore what kind of solutions there could be. So we invite you to that angle and that direction. This particular Urban Thinkers campus is on the question of reporting during pandemics and the crucial role, very, very crucial role of communications during pandemic. I refer to the popular media, I refer to the alternate media, I refer to the usual media, and the responsibility that is placed on the shoulders of media and all of us who are also beyond media into public spaces of communication together with media, onto communicating, onto actually building ideas for future. In my mind, media in this regard, and we have several esteemed panelists, I welcome them all. Some of them have already joined and will share their experiences of and responsibilities of reporting during pandemics. But I think there are very, very, very important responsibilities. Friends, as you know, the lockdowns in various countries, necessary at times, have definitely meant a lot of implications for national economics, for the trajectories nations are following, and for the people of the country. I may, for example, point out to one specific one, which is on the question of informal work in the world. Just as an example, I will actually take two examples. The first one I want to take is of the informal workers of the world, the 2.2 billion people, as ILO calls them, informal workers, people who have insecure employment, people who have insecure social protection and social security, and often not the minimum wages as well. 2.2 billion, nearly a third of our planet, and people who have most suffered these lockdowns with a reference to job losses, with a reference to losses of social security, are in most hardships. In several countries, in the cities that informal workers work in, from Africa to Asia to Latin America to Europe as well, many of these workers are on what is called the long walks home, going to places where, at least to their homes, having lost their employment. So what is the responsibility of this situation on the social media, on the mainstream media? How do we report it? With what responsibility we report it? With what solutions we report it? And with what possibilities we report it is one question perhaps the panel might want to discuss. Similarly, important question arise for the future of the cities. How resilient the cities are, how much of space the cities have to manage and to govern the crisis. In some ways, they are very, very important questions without taking too much of an airtime and without actually setting the questions for the panelists, which I think the panelists will delve into and will be responding to your questions as well. I want to welcome you all very, very warmly to this what promises to be a very exciting, at least in Asia, a late night session, and in Europe, an early evening session, and in Africa, what I could say, a late evening session, and in Latin America, perhaps an early morning session. So very warm welcome to all of us. And in closing, I want to say two things. This is the 9th in the UTC's Urban Thinkers campuses, which is virtually organized, a webinar. We have another series coming up later next month. I invite you all to join it. I invite you all to suggest agendas to all of us. I am honored to be present here as a co-chair of the World Urban Campaign, a campaign which I am really, really honored and happy to be co-chairing, a campaign which promises to be of full energy of creating the kind of inclusive urbanization we've all dreamt of. Very warm welcome, and back to you, Analia, to moderate this session. And thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Wonderful, wonderful presentation and introduction of this UTC and the role and the challenge ahead of the professionals of communication and journalists we have ahead with this pandemic. And it's a global pandemic that is affecting us well, in different parts of the globe. So we have journalists and distinguished speakers today from different cities that they are going to showcase how they are covering this situation and they, well, the different expertise that they have. I would like to add that this UTC, we proposed this UTC, this theme, because last year we organized the Urban Journalists Academy in Buenos Aires and in Mexico with more than 250 journalists of the region. So we are very, but for us it's really important to work with journalists and communication professionals, because that's key to change some behaviors in our communities, to give the voice to those people that they don't have the voice to in some communities. So that's something that we are really focused. I'm more than glad to be here moderating this session with all of you. So we have like 5 minutes of presentation for each speaker. I'm going to start with Zoe Tabari, a property right director, editor from Thomson Reuters Foundation. You are in London, so well, now the webinar is yours, so go ahead. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Nalia, and everyone. Just checking you can hear me okay.
Yes,
Excellent.
we can hear you.
Great. Just before I launch into a monologue into the void. Great. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Zoe, and I'm a journalist and editor at Thomson Reuters Foundation, which, for those of you may be more familiar with, Thomson Reuters, we're the charitable arm of TR. And there I run our coverage of cities. So this webinar is very apt for me. I'm very interested in what others have to say. In cities, land and property rights issues. So ranging from access to land, homelessness, housing in slums, indigenous and forest rights. I'm based in London, but I manage a team of 6 journalists around the world. So in Thailand, US, South Africa, and Georgia, and a broader network of freelancers. My other colleagues at TRF report on other human rights issues, ranging from women's rights, climate change, LGBT rights, and trafficking. I'd say that in terms of reporting on the pandemic, the biggest challenge for us at TRF, and I'm sure this is the case for many other journalists as well, has been that, we first and foremost report about people, particularly those around the world who kind of struggle to live their lives freely and fairly. And so not having that direct contact, both because of lockdowns, but also because of international travel restrictions, has thrown up a lot of challenges in terms of verifying information, getting people to gain your trust, which is much easier, done in person than over the phone or by email, but also adding color to your reporting, right? I mean, there's so much you can convey through, noise, kind of smell, appearance, and there's a lot less of that, of course, during the pandemic. Of course, we've also had to think about people's safety, the safety of the people we write about and kind of speak to. So a lot of the people we speak to and write about are highly vulnerable, kind of be they homeless populations, migrant workers, LGBT activists. So it was very important for us to ensure we don't put them at risk, both in terms of kind of physical contact, so not transmitting the virus to them, but also in terms of identifying them. So for some, for example, we just had to give them anonymity in our reporting because they might face discrimination or kind of intimidation for having spoken to us. We've reported a lot, for example, on how homeless people in cities are affected by the virus because of primarily the kind of lack of safe space to self-isolate, as well as poor sanitation. And the first few weeks of the pandemic, it was for us, of course, out of the question to kind of go out and report there in person and put those very vulnerable people at risk. So that meant, for example, having to work with, kind of shelters, NGOs already working with those populations, them recommending to us kind of spaces or means by which they felt homeless people would feel safe in speaking to us, but through which we could still kind of get a sense into how they were living. From the city's angle, I mean, we've also been writing about how, urban gatherings and kind of cultural events have had to move online. We're writing a lot about how the pandemic might spark a kind of shift, and already is in many cities, to green cities, by facilitating light individual transport, cycling, pedestrian use, etc. I would say that one of the, I don't want to say plus sides, because it's, this pandemic has been horrific for so many people, but one of the opportunities, for want of a better word, we've tried to use is that everyone, at least for the first few months or weeks, has been largely on social media or at home for those who have a home. So it has actually been easier in many cases to get hold of people, find people to speak to. And the exception I would add to that is government officials. So we frequently kind of interview government officials. Businesses are as part of our work. And I think governments in particular have been so, hands-on and absolutely swamped with having to deal with a pandemic that we have found it much harder to kind of get, really quick off-the-cuff comments. What we have tried to do, that said, especially during the first few weeks without having direct contact, we've just had to be, especially our reporters, absolutely dogged and just relentlessly kind of chasing people, pursuing leads, a lot of them coming through social media. So our colleague Kim, for example, is based in Johannesburg. She wrote an exclusive piece about Zamazamas, who are the informal kind of gold miners in much of the country, but mostly Johannesburg, who spend often kind of days, if not weeks at a time, mining for gold underground. but who during lockdown, for many of them, were forced to hide because if they came out, they were at risk of being arrested by the police, and yet at the same time still had to provide for their families. So that was an interesting one for us, in that, you know, normally Kim would be out and about, would see these mine shafts for herself, would get to meet the people directly, whereas in this case, she just had to try to get them on the phone. I mean, for many of them, waiting until they were able to come back out, verifying that information with local NGOs, residents, reaching out to the government. So we kind of pulled it together, but obviously much more difficult on her part. I'd say one thing, and I know we have a few multimedia colleagues on the panel as well. One thing my multimedia colleagues have had to do on our team is that a lot of the videos we do are documentaries, again, kind of first person accounts or kind of stories. So for the first few weeks and months, and now we're in some countries able to start going back out and reporting again, but for the first few weeks, we've had to shift our kind of offering. So rather than doing documentaries, we found ourselves doing more video explainers. So kind of 10-minute pieces on how your pension might fuel climate change, or how countries are rolling out surveillance measures around the world. So just kind of ensuring we still have some content to put out. And then I'd say finally, one of the strategies we've tried to adopt, and I think has relatively paid off, and I've also really enjoyed seeing this from other journalists outside of TRF, has been to kind of try to lift the lid on our own personal lives a little bit and show the behind the scenes of how you do report and what those challenges are during the pandemic. So our social team at TRF, for example, have kind of gathered content from our correspondents around the world, be it, you know, short video clips we've used on Instagram, little kind of photos, where they just show how life under lockdown has been for them. So we had our correspondent Annie in Delhi, who was, you know, secluded to her building for a whole month without being to go out at all because it had been identified as a hotspot. We've had photos and videos from our correspondent Rina in Thailand, for example, who, as she was allowed to start going back to work, kind of took pictures and videos of what life was like. So on the lifts to go to work, for example, they now have, so that people wouldn't have to kind of touch the same buttons in the lifts, they now had a whole kind of table of toothpicks. So you just grab a toothpick and then press on the floor you wanted to go to. Kind of little things like that, which for, I mean, you know, people are by their nature and curious and nosy and want to find out how other people live and how journalists do their jobs. So I think it's forced us all to be a little bit more transparent and open about how we do our work. And I've got a few recommendations for later, but I'll probably stop for now because I don't want to take too much time from others. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Wonderful presentation, and you showcase a lot of examples of how we are trying to, well, to cover and report in this pandemic and with your colleagues. So this is something that I think is very important for the people and the participants that were participating in this webinar, and they want to hear specific examples and concrete actions that journalists are doing. So thank you for that. Okay, we're going to go ahead right now with Marissa Williamson. She's the Executive Director of Catalytic Communities in Brazil. So, Marissa.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Excellent.
Okay. I'm going to show a couple of slides from here. Is that all right?
Yes. Please.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
If you could free that up, that would be great. I think it has to be, I have to be given permission. If it doesn't work, no problem.
Let's try.
Okay. Okay, it says, yeah, sorry, it says it's disabled. I'll just speak to it then.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, so I'm speaking to you from Rio in Brazil, where I'm going to talk specifically about the local context because that's where local reporting, because that's what we do. So I run Rio on Watch, which is a favela hyper local to global news source. But we report on what's happening on the ground in the city's favelas in real time in Portuguese and English. And we've been doing this for 10 years. And our reporting specifically aims to support local organizers who are trying to improve their neighborhoods. So we've got very close relationships to these communities. And I need to provide a little bit of context. I think most people here know that Brazil is now the second country in terms of COVID cases after the US, but our reporting is significantly worse than the US. So I actually think it could be comparable or getting comparable. We have such a high escalation. I was going to show you a couple of graphs and things, but just the state of Rio, our state of 44 million people, or sorry, 16 million people, has had 251 deaths just in the last day and nearly 2,500 cases in the last day. Rio is now having more cases per day than São Paulo, a state that's nearly 3 times larger in population. So we're talking about a city that's possibly or will be the epicenter at some point of the crisis. And yet this week, our mayor took down the dashboard for 4 days of cases, and they changed the methodology. And it appears now, essentially, they're not reporting on many cases where there's comorbidity factors. So people have 2 things, they have COVID, they die of COVID, but they had something else, they may not be counted as COVID, et cetera. So the first thing I was going to talk a little bit about some of the issues with how to report, right? So first of all, how do you report without data? Or with data with constantly changing methodology, right? How do you report knowing that the discourse from public officials is actually intentionally compromising prevention? So in our case, we're trying to report in ways that are benefiting favela residents, helping them protect themselves, and helping boost the local organizations that are on the ground working to fight the pandemic. But these groups are struggling against a dominant narrative coming out of our public officials, even in many cases, saying that this isn't a big deal, and so on. So you have a discourse on the ground of the issue is actually comorbidity, or there is no issue, or the economy is more important, and all of that is very strong. So how do you report? How do you help prevent, slow things down in this context, right? The testing issue, how do you report without adequate testing? Here in Rio, the way it works is if you're low income, if you're from a favela and you have symptoms, you go to the hospital, you tell them the symptoms, and they say, okay, if you still have symptoms in 2 weeks, come back and get tested. They come back 2 weeks later, they may or may not come back, they may or may not survive, it may be too late, they may get intubated and then die, they may not. But regardless, very few of those statistics are actually being represented. How do you report with the inability to be on the ground interviewing people for subtle responses, like Zoe pointed out? How do you report? You have to have those relationships ahead of time. You have to have those trust-based networks ahead of time. And then how do you report with sensibility to work with sources in favelas who are experiencing such a different reality? Because honestly, if I'm comfortable in my home and I have one of the good bubbles, how do you work with the people who are living in the middle of, essentially, they're on the front lines of a global pandemic? How do you report amidst a growing narrative that people are actually dying of alternate causes? I mentioned this. So we've got this dominant narrative now here locally. And then how do you report without falling victim to the narrative that favela residents are bound to die from this? Because that's another thing that is dominant. Oh, so you live in these dense neighborhoods with insufficient infrastructure, it's bound to happen. Well, the reality is here in Rio is that when the pandemic started taking off, you had effective local organizers that were actually keeping the rates low because they were informing residents, they were bringing in resources, they were amazing. And then we had this public discourse come in saying, actually, there's no problem. Actually, people are dying of other things. And they're just calling it coronavirus. So you've got this reality that actually there are favelas that were protecting themselves, and it's harder and harder to do that because of these outside pressures. So and then finally, how do you report such a complex reality simply and clearly? We've got a history of people thinking of favelas as slums, even though these are now generations old communities built of brick, concrete, reinforced steel, even though the government has invested in some public infrastructure in all of them. And the problem isn't isn't access, it's full access. And so what we actually need is improvements. Anyway, essentially, how do you report in a context where you've got so much complexity, you've got people in positions of power that are actually trying to use the pandemic essentially to create, to put it nicely, to cleanse parts of society that they have desired doing so in the past. It's a very complex context. And so I just wanted to bring a little bit of that to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Well, you mentioned a lot of things, especially this kind of connection that the journalists have with their people, with their communities when they're covering different issues, and how difficult it is right now to do that. And especially with we don't have protocols for this, so it's something like we are trying to, well, Zoe explained something like that. How are the measures that the journalists are doing by themselves, but not because we have a system or kind of protocol that a guidance for us. So that's something. Well, I would like to really thank you for the explanation, and also the situation in the favelas in Brazil, and how this is really affecting these communities, that they don't have properly sanitation, water, access, etc. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead with Elijah Kanji, founder of Saudi TV Kenya. Welcome, Elijah.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone.
Hi, we can hear you perfect.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Like, I think I will just go straight to what I've been doing for the last couple of months since the COVID started, and everything has changed all over the world. But the way people have reacted to COVID has also been very challenging, especially in my country, Kenya. And where I come from, I was born in Madare. It's a slum. And how things have been, it's very difficult, especially for the people. So personally, what we did as a youth group, because I'm a member of Madare Roots Youth Group and a founder of Saudi TV. So what we saw after the COVID and the curfew that was implemented by the government, we decided to do something. And that was to bring some of our friends together to contribute some money and also feed the people from our home, the slum, because some of us have already moved out, but at least we can afford something to buy food for those who can't. And it was very challenging because everything went ups and down, and the way the government reacted to it, it was as if it is something that has happened before, yet it's something completely different, whereby you're fighting the pandemic, but the people who are coming to help you, instead of helping, they make it even worse. So there is a story that I'm doing for BBC Africa Eye, and it's a piece, it's an investigative piece to do with COVID, how the government have been reacting, how people have been beaten by the police, some have even been killed. So it's an on-process story that I'm doing, a bigger piece, because as Saudi TV, there are things that we can't do, because we are a small company and a small youth group, and there are things that you can't challenge if you want to air them out there. There are things that we can film at Saudi TV, but there are things that we can't film, and those are some of the kind of the story that we are doing with other organizations. So BBC approached Saudi TV, and they approached me in person, like to personalize some of the story that we were doing at Saudi TV, because we were doing positive story on how people are trying to help other guys. And the reason why we were doing that is because we knew if the people who come from the slum, who moved out, can see what is happening, they'll be able to even chip in more and help those who are still there in the slum. And it worked, because one of our story that we did was a female feminist in the slum, and she has very good connection with the NGOs, because she's also an activist. So when we did her story, everybody was excited on what she was doing, and they were impressed, because people are not just sitting back waiting for the government to come and help. The youths themselves from the slum decided to do something, and that's what excited people to start also chipping in and doing something. So we were telling positive story. But on this other side, behind the curtain, there were other things that Sauti TV could not tell. So when BBC approached me, I told them, yes, we are doing positive story, but there are this other story that as Sauti TV, if we do, our audience is very small and we want to reach the authority. So we decided to do the story, personalize the story through me, because I have been a filmmaker inspired by my community. And that's how I got to do that story. So the story is more about the COVID and the people from the slum. So we have South TV doing positive story, but we also depend on the mainstream to do these stories that the informal settlement people will be able to air their views and they get to the authorities. There is a case that there is something that happened in Kenya just within the COVID period, whereby houses were demolished. But I called the mainstream media and I told them before the houses were demolished, I told them you need to air these stories so that people can get, the system can be able to do something, because with the COVID period, people are being told to stay at home. But the government is planning to expand a sewer channel. And you know, in non-formal settlement, people have built houses. They are so congested. They are everywhere. And if you are to build that that sewer line, you will have to fight with people. You'll have to demolish the houses for you to be able to do whatever you want to do. But at the same time, you are the same people who are advising Kenyans to stay at home to avoid the spread of the virus, which to me, I felt so bad. So the houses were finally demolished. People went for like demonstration. And it was very sad because I expected the mainstream media to do something before it happened. We should not wait for something to happen and then start reacting. So later I will see mainstream media showing how people are suffering, yet it's something that we could have prevented, but we waited until it happened. So to me, these are some of the things that I would like to see all over the world, whereby we don't react the way the Western people are reacting to this kind of, the way we react. We reacted the same way to the COVID issues, how Europe reacted. When we were being told to stay at home, we forgot that these are people in the slum. These are people who have to leave their houses to be able to earn a living. How do you keep them in the houses without them going outside? We should have planned very well in a way that they could have been provided food and they're told, don't move up and down. But right now, whatever is happening, people in the slum, some of the people, you can't reach everyone. Those who can't get food from the youth groups and this other organization, they try to go outside to look for food. By the time they're coming back to the slum, they meet with the police and the curfew time is already out. Instead of the police arresting them and taking them to places which they could have designed for those people who are late, you find people being beaten up, you find people being injured. These are deaths that will last even after the COVID. So there is a way that we reacted to the COVID pandemic that is not right, and that needs to be looked at.
Thank you, Lija. That's something that is what I would like to go back again, because something that you mentioned in terms of positive messages for our communities. Living this pandemic, people need to hear also good news, but it's struggling because mostly we have to inform our communities in terms of data. And also this pandemic put us more clearly all the problems that we have in terms of urbanization and sanitation access and so on. So I think that's something that especially in the communities we need to go through that also during this pandemic. And that's something that you put it clear, and how with your Saudi TV, you're trying to do your big effort with your enterprise. So that's something very, very interesting to show, especially for youth. So thank you, Lija.
Thank you.
Okay, now Alexander, head journalist for a New Desk Asia. of Austrian Broadcasting Corporation. Welcome, Alexander. We would like to hear you.
Well, welcome. Hello, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. So I am here now the representative of the mainstream media, as it was already talked about a few times. And I'd like to make maybe 3 points in the beginning now about my experience covering the COVID crisis. The first is, I think it's paramountly important that we as a journalist, we stand our ground. Because I, of course, also feel this in between. We are, as journalists, especially working with public broadcasters like I am here in Austria, in Vienna, we do have a very big responsibility in transferring and spreading, so to say, the message of the authorities, of the government, in regarding the measures against COVID, informing the people who listen or watch us what they should do, etc. But at the same time, it's clear that there comes a point where you have to ask yourself whether there might be also criticism, whether it's fair to ask back then, for example, the government authorities, the representatives about is it a sensible thing to do this, or is it a sensible thing to do that? Why didn't you do this earlier, etc. We are, of course, also experiencing here that the officials are not very eager to go into details on how they made some of their decisions, actually. Yeah, it is a bit a ping-pong play between government officials and medical experts. Yeah. To try to get into the details of how these decisions, for example, have been made, how the decisions actually came up. That is very important. So I think to be always aware that, yes, of course, you are responsible for getting the message out. People should do this. People should be aware of that. You also have to always be aware of what is actually your journalistic duty in, like being investigative and being critical. The second thing is, I noted it down here, it's watch your lingo. We are talking about the health crisis. And that is, of course, that means that a lot of medical experts are going to try to explain to people what this all is about. I mean, we don't know everything about the coronavirus. We know much more than we did maybe 2 or 3 months ago. But to have this position where you as a journalist, you have to take this medical language, the terms, and to translate it into a language that is for most of the people understandable. That is something I think that is also that has become very much important, more important maybe than if you were discussing a political crisis. Yeah, because you have to be aware that people are not so much used to that kind of terminology. So I think it's very important always also to think about that, how you have to adapt your language to your audience. And then there comes another, for me personally, being part of the foreign news desk, of course there are other levels or other issues that have become very important. For example, it's already been said, how do you report when you're not there? I mean, we of course have a network of correspondents, for example, but those correspondents themselves were locked down in many countries. So those who were working on site, so to say, were not able to go out. How do you try to also, even internally, get the stories through, like, why don't we look now, let's say, at Southeast Asia, even though you have the domestic stories that are now, of course, much more important when it comes to how a news bulletin is basically created. But you have to have your voice heard and say, there is a local perspective and there is a global perspective. And we must not forget that this is a global crisis and that you have to push through also those topics and those issues that are from foreign countries, maybe very far apart, but this is a global crisis. Yeah, so that is something that I have come across. And in terms of urban areas versus rural areas, at least here, we have a very big discussion about how are urban areas dealing, population in urban areas dealing with COVID, and how are populations in rural areas dealing with it. And it seems that somehow it's now becoming to a point where even governments are trying to maybe make a difference, whether you're living in a city or you're living in a rural area, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. And I'm very sorry to say there is a bit of blaming going on. Are those living in the city to blame for spreading the virus faster because they might not adhere to, like a lot of the measures that much? Is this even true? Or is it a kind of prejudice? So this is, of course, these were a few things that I've encountered now in the last few months, covering COVID around the world globally in my daily work, but also trying to get these stories even through and say, let's also look at other countries and other areas.
Thank you, Alexander. That's something very interesting that you point out, that it's the differences of in every country we have regions with more or less population. We cannot put the, well, some communications or tools like everyone is living the same situation, because it's not like that. Also in an apartment without balcony is something, with balcony is other, if you have a yard or not, if you live with in a crowded apartment. So it's all the habitats that we have right now put us more clearly that we need to give a message also for this kind of different audiences that we have. And it's something like perhaps in other issues we didn't have to pay attention on that specific detail. And right now, yes, because that makes the main difference, the main point. So I think that's absolutely interesting. And also, well, all of you have been pointed out what is the main difficulty for of covering this pandemic is that you are not on the field because the lockdown, you need some permissions to go and do an interview, or so it's something like it changed absolutely completely the activity of covering a theme, an issue. So that's something where I think that's something very clear. Okay, I'm going to go right now with Ashley Wombley. She is the Director of Communication of Crisis Text Line USA and UK. And Ashley, she's going to talk us in a different role, because she's the head of communication of an organization that she's mainly the source for journalists and the media. So Ashley, welcome, and we listen to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I've really enjoyed hearing from all of the other panelists so far. And so as you mentioned, so Crisis Text Line is a organization that provides free crisis counseling via text. We are currently operating English only in the United States, and in the UK and Ireland, and then in English and French in Canada. We are expanding, however, and by the end of 2022, we expect to be operating in any country where people speak English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, or Arabic. So hopefully we'll be covering about 1/3 of the world, because we already knew that people needed free crisis counseling and via text. And I think that the pandemic has really increased the need for that. And so we're excited for that. So Crisis Text Line provides a service that is primarily what we do. However, the kind of a secondary mission of our organization is to use the data that we are able to collect in a way that improves public health and for social good. And so we have a data corpus of 150 million text messages right now. It's anonymized and aggregated so that to respect privacy, of course. So it's not possible for anyone to know what individual texters are texting, but in fact we can share basic trends back. And we've been doing this for about almost 7 years, but really the past 2 months we have seen just a massive increase in the need for our service, but more than that, the need for our data, right? So the United States, of course, is now the place with is where we're headquartered, and place with the most COVID infections at this point. We, in the very beginning of this crisis, started to see that the number one thing that people were reaching out to us was about anxiety. Because we are a broad crisis line, you can text us for any crisis, whether that's financial stress, suicidal thoughts, or relationship issues even. Typically depression is the number one thing that people text us about, depression and relationship issues and anxiety. We saw that anxiety was the first wave of messages from texters. And then as the pandemic continued on, we started to see that, in fact, the quarantines, which were of course designed to keep people physically safe and physically healthy, have started to really impact negatively people's mental health. So we started to see an increase in depression and isolation. Another trend that we were concerned about based on research from previous disasters and that we had our eye on was the fact that many people are quarantining with people who might not be safe, and in fact could be abusive. So we have seen an increase in unfortunately in emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. It's not a massive part of it's certainly only a small percentage of the data, or sorry, of the texts that we are getting, but it has increased from pre-COVID. And then, and we're also seeing racism, especially among our Asian texters. So what we do whenever journalists contact us is we give that data. We share it in a couple of ways. We share it on our website, which is crisistextline.org. On our blog, our CEO and co-founder has been doing a series called How America's Feeling, and it's really focused in on the trends that we've spotted. We also have our data available on a website, and I'll share all of these in the chat, crisistrends.org. Which is a self-service place where people can go in and check. Again, this right now it is just the United States data, but as we expand, we will be adding other countries to that. And then thirdly, I've been sending out a newsletter, a crisis trends news tip every week that you're welcome to subscribe to on our website as well, with some of these trends. So, for example, today's newsletter will be about the LGBT community and COVID. So really kind of zero in on some special populations. I would say that in the last couple of months, a few things that I've learned, and I've been in this role for a few years, and I've been in this role of doing crisis communications for mental health organizations for about a decade, and I was a journalist before. So a few things that have really stood out to me that I've learned in these past couple of months. One, reporting on percentage increases in volume is not helpful. A lot of stories have come up in the especially among some of the smaller organizations in the United States, sometimes saying things like, our call volume is up 900%. That just scares people. And whenever you do the math there, you may find out that it's gone from 10 calls a day because there wasn't a disaster to 50 calls a day, or 150 calls a day. So as a journalist, advice I would have as a journalist is ask for those raw numbers. Don't ask for the percentages. The percentages don't tell you anything. They're too easy to manipulate. Now, we always want to share percentages and not raw numbers. It's harder to get those out also, you know, as a from the internal side. But as a journalist, I would ask for the raw numbers. We're always happy to share them. You know, we may not be able to, so when it comes to specific populations, like we're not going to be able to share like the specific number of people from Minnesota who are texting about sexual abuse in the month of June, right? Because that starts to get too low, the numbers, you start to invade privacy. But so that's my number one tip, is ask for raw data, don't just rely on percentages, or even if you want to report percentages, get the numbers to figure out exactly what's going on. The second thing is, I would say, is that the story, what might not be a story, sometimes is the most valuable story you can tell. So in the United States, people, including the President of the United States, started to say that suicide is going to rapidly increase. Of course, in the United States, suicide is already a tremendous problem. We lose about 30,000, anywhere between 30 and 40,000 people to suicide every year. And so it's alarmist to say that. And in fact, it's not true at all. I've had a number of reporters from really well-respected publications call or email me and say, you know, can you tell us like how many more people you're hearing about suicide? And I say, suicide actually has gone down. We are seeing significantly lower conversations with people about suicide, and that is even if you control for the fact that we are having more volume right now. And there are a couple of ways that we can report out on that. One is our number of active rescues, which we have to do whenever someone is unable to stay safe, and we have to work with local mobile crisis centers or sometimes law enforcement to help save someone's life. The number of those have also gone down. So that is the story itself, right? So I sometimes have reporters say, well, this is, you know, I'm writing a story about this, and I know that it's hard to, you kind of want to go for the story that you want to write the story your editor requested of you, but sometimes there's a more valuable story to tell when your hypothesis is not correct. Those would be the two things that I've really seen lately.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you so much. I think that you said something very important in terms of the data. Why is relevant the data, and what is the limit also to use the data? No? So it's something like we've been noticing, especially in Latin America, a lot of media, they are putting all the time data in terms of the numbers of people dying of COVID-19, and the people is starting their day with that information. They in the middle of the day also, at the end of the day also. So it's something like, okay, that's what is this useful for me right now. So that's something like in which point this is something that it comes with recommendations, with some actions that as individuals we can do or in our families, or it's just data and that's it. So something is, and of course in terms of Crisis Text Line, that is an NGO that it works hardly to get that information, and also it's an important tool for governments to create public policies and how to try to solve these issues, and in terms of healthy issues, and it's something like, I think it will be wonderful if we can get it in different countries, not only USA and UK. I know that you are doing a tremendous work trying to do that, and I think that would be awesome if we can get it.
Latin America should be really soon, much sooner than 2022.
Excellent. Thank you, Ashley. We're going to, right now, with John Paget and Chris Elizara, the co-founders of First Main Films, the co-hosters of this webinar. So welcome, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks. We are delighted to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit and then pass it off to John. I am in San Diego County, and John is in Buffalo, New York. So that's where I'm coming to you from. And, like Ashley, who was a journalist, um, we're not journalists. We're filmmakers, but we fit into this landscape of journalism and mass communication. And I think I just want to take a few minutes to kind of explain how we fit into that landscape. But to tell how we fit in, we got to just describe the landscape itself a little bit. And the landscape, I think, as I would describe it, just in three simple ways. We have a fast and short cycle 24-hour news industry. That's print, radio, TV. And then we have mainstream versions and alternative stream versions. And we have social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. But that's fast, short cycle industry news. Then we have a medium cycle media, which would include like weekly magazines. Print examples include like The Economist, Newsweek, 60 Minutes for TV in the US, and that type of stuff. And then in the print side, again, Sunday editions of newspapers or TV or radio specials. A little bit more medium cycle to the reporting, to the information, to the news. And then there's slow media. Slow media monthly magazines, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, and then documentary films in both short form and long form. That's the landscape per se, but there's another piece of that landscape. We live in a post-literary world. So mass communication of the news, truth, must include video and film, and TV social media production, distribution, and consumption. So this is how we, First and Main Films, fits into the journalist, news, information, and mass communications landscape, because we produce slow media, which is visual documentary style narratives and films on carefully selected subjects. And we produce an urban focused film festival called the Better Cities Film Festival. And in conjunction with UN Habitat, we produce a version of the film festival called the UN Habitat Better Cities Film Festival. So, that's, why we, filmmakers in the slow media side are part of this conversation, because we fit into the landscape in a particular type of way. And I always want to turn it over to John now to say, how we contribute with what we do, and how we do it, why we do it, and how it contributes in an important way. So, John, why don't you take it from here?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. I think we see ourselves, Chris and I, and all filmmakers as potentially really storytelling allies to the reporters, the full spectrum of journalists and reporters, and also allies to the activists and thought leaders that are trying to achieve some of the goals of, for example, UN Habitat and sustainable development. So, and I think that in listening to what you all have had to say with some of the challenges of reporting in the news right now, I think filmmakers like ourselves are going to play a perhaps more vital role than usual, because it's been so hard to report in real time based on some of the practical challenges people have identified, and what Alexander was alluding to with sort of the challenge of the crash course that journalists are under to learn about all this really complex subject and then translate it to everybody, to a broad audience, all doing that all in real time, and then balancing the need to serve the public with dissemination of vital information from authorities, balancing that with critique and investigation. So because we arrive later into the stream, into the news cycle, and we take more time to craft the story, I think that we'll be able to take on that challenge more. Hopefully some of the challenges will change, as we get onto the field. But also we'll have that luxury of more time to investigate and critique.
Yep.
I think the other thing is we're shooting also for impact. I mean, when we create film, yes, we're creating entertainment, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're creating stories with emotional power. And by nature of this, the work that we can do can really can really serve advocacy towards what we all want to achieve. And so I would say that what we want to really do is develop more connection and collaboration with reporters and filmmakers to integrate them better, because we depend on them and we can be those allies longer term. Chris, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you've kind of hit on the main things. I mean, we can keep a story because you come late in the cycle. We can add to the duration of a story. Things can go in and out of favor in public conscious, in the public mind. But we, bringing a film, a month later, 2 months later, can revitalize an issue and keep an issue burning in the public's mind by what we do. We can amplify and add additional context to the stuff that we hear in the 24-hour cycle throughout timeline process. We can also focus. A lot of times there is so much happening, during the pandemic that there's too much to focus on. But we can sift through, distill, discern essential, reliable information and focus on it, with what we can do later in the cycle. And then that leads to the impact like you just described. So yeah, we rely on journalists. And then the thing that we want to do, and this is our second main point, is do more. We want to bring more filmmaker allies into this landscape. So more filmmaker allies means more stories. The more stories, the better. And so that means we need to produce more, screen more, distribute more urban city stories. We need more voices. I mean, Elijah is there in Kenya, in Nairobi. He's getting his voice out. We need more diversity of stories, more diversity of filmmakers, and the more the better. So we have a bunch of recommendations, but we'll come back to those as we get to the recommendation conversation later to say, how do we get more stories? How do we get more diversity? How do we get more distribution, and so on and so forth? We'll talk about that when we get to our recommendation conversation. So thanks.
Thank you, Chris and John. Thank you so much. I think that's something like people is very exciting to and expecting to see stories in the and films about this pandemic, and I think that we have a tremendous work ahead in terms of that. So we're going to listen all of your recommendations. I mean, what I would like that we have like a couple of questions right now in the QA section to the speaker. So perhaps we can start from there. And also, I would like to see, perhaps with the questions, Christine, you can help me with that, to make a selection of the questions and to see what are those questions for, like for which specific speaker or to all of them. But we would like in this UTC to have specific recommendations. As Chris, you said, what are the arising priorities and actions that we need to get, and especially those kind of tips and recommendations that every one of you have been working to increase the safety of your work. Some of you, like Zoe and Teresa, have you already showcasing some examples, but I would like if we can get specific tips and short tips that we can share with the audience, because where there are journalists, communication professionals, that they are participating in this webinar and listen to us. So listening to us, so I think that would be great to have. Perhaps we can start with the recommendations, Christine, and then we can select the questions that people have been doing in the QA section. So let's start with Chris and John with the recommendations, and then I'm going to go backward with to Ashley, Alexander, and the rest of the speakers.
Okay, we'll just be really quick. You know, our recommendations get to the point of, you know, how can we get more filmmaker allies, more stories produced by us, adding, you know, to the effort. So we just have several recommendations. We need numerical growth. We just need more filmmakers. We need to grow the city-focused filmmaking community in its size, its diversity, gender, race, class, and nationality. We need numerical growth in all of those. We need to invest in capacity building and diversity for filmmakers. So that means investing in the professional skills and the film craft of filmmakers in our community. And we invest in the diversity of city-focused filmmakers so they can produce better films, more films, diverse voices, and diverse stories. And then the third thing, John, do you want to take about the third thing, which is, you know, there needs to be a filmmaker economy that that we can actually do the work. So what's our economy? How can we get this filmmaker economy going? And John, do you just want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, one of the vehicles we've developed for that is the Better Cities Film Festival, and with UN Habitat, the UN Habitat Better Cities Film Festival. And that serves as a platform to screen and exhibit these films, and it operates as a distributed type of film festival, a satellite festival, so that cities, any city in the country or around the world, can program this content at their own event. They can host their own screening event, and everything, the films are provided to them digitally, and they do their own thing. So that's one of the things we've done to try to develop that. I would also say that we, what I alluded to earlier, you know, we want to increase sort of the networking and dialogue between thought leaders and reporters, like all of our participants today, with filmmakers. So we operate a forum for filmmakers to be in dialogue with people like yourselves. And if any of you would be interested in participating, what that looks like is we do a virtual event like this, bring you on, have dialogue, and basically, you know, expose your thinking to our community of urban filmmakers. So from years of doing this, we have a whole community of hundreds of urban filmmakers who are interested in, invested in topics like this. And they want to be able to dialogue on these issues with you and get ideas, get story leads, ideas for films, things like that. So if any of you would be interested in participating in that, let us know, reach out. We'd love to bring you into that.
Oh, that's terrific. That's exciting news that you have been telling us. So this platform is already launched, or are you going to make an announce of this opportunity? I think that's great.
We just launched sort of during during the shutdown. So we're building it. We've had a couple events so far, but yeah, it's off and running.
And the
Wonderful.
film festival And the film festival, I mean, the partnership with UN Habitat is really critical because it provides a platform for filmmakers to put their work out. And if there's no place to put a film work out or get awards and to convene the community that UN Habitat is helping us to do, funders are not going to fund the films. They're not going to fund the filmmakers. Not going to fund the stories. So, that film festival, we've kicked it off at WOOF 10. I guess again there'll be another one in WOOF 11. It can travel, and then we have the Better Cities Film Festival in the U.S. as well. So yeah, there is both of those things are happening and real, and people can plug into those.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Those are the kind of concrete actions that people and organizations are working so hard to do that, especially during this pandemic. So thank you for that. I think it's a recommendation, but a concrete action too that you are doing and leading. So thank you for that to both. Okay, so now with Ashley, what are your recommendations or tips that you've been thinking for the audience?
Yeah, I think that I would be remiss to not remind people to take care of themselves. You are reporting on, on the impacts of this on frontline workers oftentimes, and you are frontline workers yourself. So I think that it's really important to, to make space and time for yourself and to build a self-care practice or to draw on some supports. I would love to say the Crisis Text Line is there for you in all of your countries, but we're not there in most of them quite yet. Just keep going after the facts because we really need them now.
Excellent. Well, that's the linkage that you did with the data and the use that we need to do of that. So that's great. Alexander?
Well,
yeah.
It might sound a bit old-fashioned, but I think networking. That's what we need, because networking is gonna, for example, lead to fact-checking. If you're talking about COVID, we're talking an awful lot about numbers, for example, and how numbers can be interpreted, or how numbers even are tried to also be differently sold, so to say, by politicians or authorities. And to know, well, I can call this person or email this person or email another person and have local contacts out of the journalist's bubble sometimes even. That is very, very important to get an insight about the global effects and also the different versions, because we're all living through, I think, a different version of COVID somehow. I mean, it's all the same virus, but it's very different if I sitting here in my cozy home in Vienna or if I'm in a slum in Kenya. And still, we need to connect it. So I would say networking, and definitely what has been said, reaching out to other groups of professionals, other groups of frontliners, and other groups that are basically living through that crisis now, and build networks that might be the next time we are facing something like that, maybe not that threatening like a deadly virus. We have established already networks that are helping us to get the story out, but to get the story out from the people to the people.
That's right. I fully agree. And of course, I think that I would love to have like a kind of protocol for journalists to cover in pandemic. And that, I think that is something that we are missing, and it will be really useful. So perhaps in this webinar, after this webinar, we can work on that too. And thank you, Alexander. Elijah?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes.
I'm following closely. And thank you. I'm happy to see that something is happening apart from just sitting back, despite the fear of the COVID. So for me, I'm happy to be here. And one of my recommendation will be, it is good for people also to do positive stories apart from the negative story. And the most important thing is that the most important thing is that people like positive story. It's only that the mainstream media, it's into business. And whenever they do their stories, they go with what will sell. So if we can have an alternative way, which I'm also trying in my small way, is to do positive story and to show people that despite the fear, there is something good that people can as well do. And those are some of the things that I'm trying to do through Sauti TV. So through Sauti TV is just showing the activist work in the field, feminist work, and also other youth group leaders who are doing something for their community. So Sauti TV is now small. It's doing only in Mathare, but in future, I would like also to grow and get also to these other non-formal settlements within Nairobi, and in future in the whole country. But at the moment, I'm also working with African Censored and the BBC to just air some of the hard-hitting views and the stories which happens behind the curtains.
Wonderful, Elijah. I fully agree also in the positive messages that we need to hear. And also as audience, we are waiting a lot to hear good news. So I think that's a tremendous effort that you are doing in your country, and of course I see that all this kind of network that is growing through the World Urban Campaign. Perhaps you can work also with Chris and John in terms of to create a storytelling, a positive storytelling too. I think that will be awesome to see.
That's what I wanted to mention actually at the end, whereby I after listening to
well,
Chris,
I'm doing
John,
the connection, so don't worry. I'm working
so
on that.
we'll do that after this. So we'll keep on doing positive story despite the how small we are. We can as well reach to the people who deserve to get the message and act.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elijah. There is Teresa.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad I get to talk after others because I can reflect. And I think what Elijah just said, or Elijah, is it Elijah or Elijah? Elijah?
Any can do. It's okay. It's okay.
Elijah.
So I think that's very much very important to focus on positive stories. I just wanted to, before mentioning recommendations, talk about sort of pull back to before the pandemic and reporting. So if we look at Rio, for example, how favelas have always been reported, there's always a sensational overtone, and which goes back to literally 100 years ago when reporting started happening on these communities in Rio, right after slavery was abolished, kind of context. And that set the stage for how these communities have been reported on for, decades and decades. And the last few years that improved, and this is where I think the recommendations come from, because of an incredible ecosystem that has emerged of grassroots media. So we have hundreds of community-based media outlets in Rio in different favelas. Some of them are social media-based, some are written publications, some of them are video, etc. And I think that several people brought up here the question of less contact with people, right? The difficulty of contacting people on the ground, the need for more voices, the diversity of stories, the more the better, right? From Chris and John. Alexander talked about how do you report when you're not there, and all of these. And the answer actually is that there's already this ecosystem, at least in some places, certainly in Rio, of people on the ground who do communications work. And so what I think we should take from this is the importance of developing and encouraging a robust, diverse media ecosystem that goes at all levels, from the hyper local all the way through global, and how we can connect all of these folks. What we do is we ask communities to self-report. People are in the communities, they can report. They're grassroots journalists. They can report directly. The Guardian has had a partnership in the past with favela-based journalists, for example. And so how do you get those voices direct? Those people are in constant contact, thanks to social media and cell phones, with residents. They don't need to necessarily be door to face to face. They know who to trust. So we can create these trusted networks. And some of this already exists, which is what we are using now because it's been built here in Rio. We as an organization, basically what Rio on Watch and our organization, Broadly Catalytic Communities, does is we take these hyper-local voices that we know and trust, and then we find ways to bridge that with other networks that can support those local people. Yeah, so I think that's the big one that I would introduce. Oh, also the idea of crowdsourcing, which is related to that. So for example, I mentioned earlier the data issues here in Rio, the fact that we're not testing really adequately, we're not reporting adequately, so the data are messed up. They're also not broken down by favelas, so people don't actually know, unless they're from large favelas that are doing their own dashboards. They don't actually know how many people have been affected or if their community is even at risk. So we're in the middle of developing a dashboard with a number of partners locally and internationally to crowdsource data from favelas through these local groups about, you know, who's got how many confirmed cases, how many confirmed deaths, and also do self-reporting through an app or a website. So I think these are some ways that you can sort of manage with the situation that could benefit. And of course, if there aren't local media channels, there are local NGOs and community-based organizations everywhere. And so those are those also do the same kind of work.
So we're going to be waiting for that dashboard that you mentioned. I think that will be a fantastic tool to cover this pandemic, and also perhaps for other communities too, to see what are your example and how are you compiling all the information of the favelas. So thank you, Teresa. Thank you so much. And Zoe? So we have time for
thanks
the
everyone.
questions. Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, I echo what a lot of the panelists have said. I've mentioned kind of already, lifting the lid on your own work and kind of how you do it, trying to share your personal settings a bit more where appropriate. Be it kind of in lockdown or as you start to go out and reporting. One thing I would say that has been really useful to us, and again, where appropriate for you guys, being creative and using the assets you do have. So at TRF, we're very lucky, for example, that being a part of Reuters, we have a huge picture archive and also extensive footage of stock footage. So, as I was saying, not being able to do proper documentaries and stuff, other than the longer video explainer pieces I've mentioned, we've also done kind of short 1-2 minute clips for social, where we, for example, kind of aggregated funky examples of social distancing in cities. For example, the swimming noodle hats you might have seen in the German cafe, or the kind of like social bubbles that you're supposed to stay within in parks, kind of things like that. So lots you can do with just basic stock footage, and also being more creative in terms of using your interviewees. So we had a tech story, for example, on van lifers in the US, so who are this kind of nomad community who are constantly on the road, essentially living in RVs. And they have seen their kind of way of life kind of thrown apart by the pandemic. And so where normally we would have sent, one of our multimedia producers with our reporter to go kind of film these guys for themselves, what we did was just give the interviewees themselves some kind of very basic guidance on filming themselves, kind of filming their environment, sending us a few clips. And then our producer in London, Morgan, put together a lovely little 3-minute video, none of which came from, our own footage. So that there is stuff you can kind of do from that. I'd also encourage people to, what has really helped us has been to rely actually on freelancers on the ground a lot more. So I think I've never more than now, kind of rather than just relying on our own staff, worked with local journalists who, themselves are kind of looking for ways to supplement their income. And who, for a lot of them, either have the contacts or in some contexts are able to kind of go out and report earlier than you might do at home. So we've been working with them a lot more, which has kind of made for some nice joint bylines from datelines, which we wouldn't normally report from. And then my final recommendation would probably be to try to kind of keep your head above just the day-to-day, you know, it can be so easy to get stuck into the day-to-day coronavirus reporting, reporting just on kind of numbers, you know, daily developments. But we're trying to kind of take a step back and take stock of how these changes might affect not just vulnerable people, but also, you know, for the context of this webinar, cities in the longer term. So one series I'm running, for example, is going to call Cities Reboot, are different ways that cities are emerging from lockdown, but also ways in which urban life might be altered in the much longer term, from the kind of workplace to public transport, to the way we redefine kind of social experiences and things like that. So trying to, where you can, kind of carve out that time to think, okay, what issues or what projects do I want to look in the longer run, rather than just daily developments.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you so much. Yeah, I fully agree too with all the tips and recommendations of the speakers. And Christine, I think we have a couple of questions from the audience, from the participants. So perhaps we can do a selection.
We have very little time, unfortunately, but I think they were, you know, since this is in the context of the, you know, World Urban Campaign, we are talking about urban situation, and how do you reflect on the future of cities as journalists? You know, this is, as you said, you know, you have the fast media, slow media, but how this can help shape the future of cities. There were a few questions on planners and architects and so on. So there is an interest from the crowd to have some thought from your side.
Okay, that question is for Zoe, or?
No, it's a general question, I think, but I think Chris could be the one to answer.
Okay. Yeah,
yeah, and then maybe I think we should wrap up, and Sandeep should conclude. That's my suggestion. Yeah.
Excellent.
John, do you want to take a shot at that? Oh, John? John there?
Go ahead, Chris.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So how are you? How do you reflect on the future of cities from all the, you know, what your work as journalist and at different level?
You know, I think for us, and we will come at from different ways. I mean, the worst thing that we can do is make ourselves into prognosticators that are always failing. So that means that we need to really be thoughtful about what we talk about the future of cities, that we're taking in, you know, reliable information. We're engaging with thought leaders, and we're engaging with the institutions that are really having to shape that future. Not in theory, but bringing the theory and the best ideas, the finance and institutions that are actually doing stuff. So we have to track with that, and then, you know, lend what we can in our storytelling to provide, make it understandable, make it simple enough for people to perceive it, and then create a narrative that supports, you know, those best things that come together. So, you know, UN Habitat is an example of an organization that, as we think through the future of cities, we should be tracking with. We should be tracking with other institutions as well. But that's one that, you know, is reliable, and it's doing that type of work. And so I think that's kind of the best way I can kind of answer that. You know, turning up to the places that the conversation is happening, asking the tough questions, getting the responses back, and then putting it into our content that we produce. It comes down to, I think, in terms of the future, as we do our work, you know, do they trust us? And that all comes down to the way that we work and the way we do our professional job. And so I think I just mentioned a few ways that we become trustworthy commentators and collaborators as we build the future of of cities going forward. And as I think about it from my perspective, we're going to make films about how do we get to make pandemic proof cities in the future. I mean, that's a theme that has multiple pieces to it, but that's a theme that we're going to be telling stories about. I mean, if we boil it down to that, what do we learn from this experience, and how can we apply it to pandemic-proof cities, neighborhoods, communities around the world for the future? So with that, I think I'll stop and pass it back to you.
Okay. Okay, excellent, Chris. I think that Christine, Sandeep, do you want to, you have some announcements to do, and also perhaps a final conclusion, or so we'll do that after you.
Thank you. On behalf of the World Urban Campaign, it's been a great honor to be with very, very inspiring and creative panelists. I want to make a few points. So I want to first of all thank all the panelists and the moderator, Analia. It's not easy to have such a wide array of wonderful people and manage a conversation. So well done, Analia, and thank you to all the panelists. I want to say a few things in conclusion, and these are not summarization of what has already been said. To all the people who joined in and stayed with us, a big thank you. I lead ActionAid Association India, and for the past 2 months, we've reached out relief to something like 2.7 million informal workers in all the states of India. And I'm talking strictly from that experience. And I'm also talking from the experience of ActionAid Federation, which works in 46 countries, including in some of the countries where the panelists, esteemed panelists, are here from today. And basis of that experience, I want to make a few remarks building on the points that have been said in the context of cities. And one of the first points, Teresa reporting from the favelas and talking about the realities of the favelas in Brazil, or even Zoe, who was talking from the perspective of Thomson Reuters Foundation and the wonderful work that they've done. Chris, who's talking of the films, thank you, and all the other speakers as well. I think the key question is there are many, many narratives in our world. Let me take an example of the narratives of refugees of the world, the 60, 70 million people of the world who are facing COVID in cities or in peri-urban areas is a very different reality from those who are facing it as informal workers who are trudging back home, from the women of the world who's let me say, for whom domestic abuse in a sense has gone up in all the countries of the world that I've seen reports from, to the children of the world who are locked down, can't go to schools, are pushed to online educations for those who can afford it, or are out of education for those who can't. Child marriage has increased. Child trafficking is likely to increase. So there are many, many narratives in the world. Zoe was talking of narratives of homeless people. I mean, one could talk of narratives of a whole range of global diversities. So I think there are many, many narratives, and therefore, in as much as some of the speakers were speaking, it is important to communicate the perspective of safety and security. Is also important to communicate for the media. It's also important to communicate the perspective of all the masses of the world, all the diversities of the world. I think good policy making is at the intersection of both. And to me, that is one of the bigger responsibilities of the social media, of the mainstream media, and of all kind of medias whose realities, citizen reporting was talked of today by Teresa. So that's one reality that I would like to say. So the multiple narratives and the responsibility of the media to be able to represent those narratives, to be able actually to represent the narratives of those who suffer the most, such that policy making in a larger sense can be addressed to the needs of the people who suffer the most. So I think that's the first thing I'd like to say. I think in regard to this question of cities, and that's my second point, there are lots of hard lessons. There are lots of wonderful lessons for the kind of urban futures we want to see in the 21st century. Lessons of what public health infrastructure needs to be. Lessons for what cities in particular need to do with reference to public health. I mean, New York leads to one kind of lessons. New Delhi and Mumbai leads to another kind of lessons. Nairobi would lead to a third kind of lessons. And I think we need to distill those lessons, for instance, of public health, for instance, of lessons for the city makers of each of our cities, what kind of troubles they have been through and what kind of solutions we need to find for them in future. So I think there are multiple lessons for the kind of urbanization, inclusive urbanization, just urbanization, egalitarian urbanization, and the cities of future that we wish to build. And I think these are the lessons I think media has a big responsibility in the coming months, in the coming years, to distill and to build it to a public debate and public opinion. So that's my second more general point. A lot of you spoke to that in very diverse ways. I also want to not take too much more time, but to kind of conclude this by not just by thanking each one of you, but by also welcoming you to another round of Urban Thinkers campuses, which are proposed for months to come, which are proposed from next month onwards. We are looking for ideas from you. We're looking for ideas from what kind of thinkers campuses, webinars, and other virtual spaces we could organize in the coming months, and physical spaces, hopefully later on in the year or in the years to come. What kind of solutions and what kind of, based on the lessons that we've learned, what kind of solutions can we distill together? We, as always, at the World Urban Campaign and at the UN Habitat, are very, very interested in looking at solutions, in looking at alternatives, in response to the challenges that we all face, such that we can build a much more inclusive, egalitarian, just, and equal urbanization, such that we can build what all of us dream, the cities of the future, just cities of the future. With that, I'd like to close, thanking you very much for staying on with us. I see a lot of participants still around. It's pretty late in Asia, at least. So thank you for staying with us. Thank you to all the panelists for your wonderful insights. Happy to see many of you love to work with you in future. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Christine. Christine, if you're around and you're still around, I would like you to formally conclude it on behalf of the UN Habitat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you all. It was a great session. At UN Habitat, we are interested to build an urban future with policymakers, planners, civil society, community leaders, grassroots leaders. And I think the media is part of this large community to build urban futures and to guide citizens in the best choices that cities will have to rely on. So I think it would be great if we could continue this conversation, have another set of UTCs, specifically focusing on cities, communities in the global south and in the north as well. Thank you all. Thank you, Analia. And
thank you,
we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you to all. The recommendations will be embedded in the City We Need manifesto in the website. And also we're going to do a new series webinars, UTCs. So please be in touch. We are going to, and stay tuned. We're going to be to you sending the information soon. So warm regards to everyone, greetings, and we keep in touch, and we hope that you have enjoyed this webinar.